You're sitting in a room full of people who are supposed to matter. The tree's lit, the table's full. Someone's laughing at something that happened last Christmas, and everyone's nodding like the memory lives in all of you equally. Except it doesn't. You're smiling, you're present, but somewhere between the small talk and the decorations that feel too bright, you started wondering, am I the only one pretending this feels like something? Not sad, not angry, just distant in a way you can't explain without sounding like you're the problem. Because Christmas is supposed to be automatic, right? You show up, you feel it, you belong. But what if you don't? What if the magic everyone talks about feels like a language you used to speak fluently, and now you're just repeating phrases, hoping no one notices you've forgotten what they mean? The worst part isn't the emptiness. It's the suspicion that maybe you've become the kind of person who can't access this anymore, that everyone else is living inside something beautiful, and you're somehow locked out, watching through glass you didn't even know was there. So the question isn't why Christmas feels heavy, it's why you seem to be the only one carrying the weight. You want to know what makes this worse. It's not what's happening right now that's crushing you, it's what Christmas reveals. Because this day doesn't create pain. It just turns up the volume on everything you've been trying not to hear all year. The distance between who you are and who you thought you'd be by now. The gap between the life you're living and the one you convinced yourself was still coming. The slow, creeping realization that while everyone else seems to be moving forward, building, becoming, belonging, you've been stuck in some invisible waiting room and no one's called your name. Christmas doesn't hurt because it's joyful and you're not. It hurts because it forces you to compare, not to others. That's the easy part. To yourself, to the version of you that was supposed to exist by now. And when that version doesn't show up, when the mirror reflects someone you don't recognize living a life you didn't plan for, that's when the weight becomes unbearable. But what if I show you that this feeling, this exact heaviness you're ashamed of, is actually separating you from most people in a way you haven't understood yet? That the ones who feel this aren't broken, they're awake. And that changes everything about what happens next. You need to understand something that no one explains correctly. Christmas isn't an event, it's an interrogation, and you're both the suspect and the jury. Every unresolved tension you've been carrying, every quiet disappointment you've learned to live with, every moment you felt yourself shrinking to fit into a life that wasn't built for the person you're becoming, Christmas doesn't comfort you through any of it. It cross-examines you. It sits you down in a room you can't leave and asks, so where did you think you'd be by now? And suddenly, every compromise you made, every dream you shelved, every version of yourself you abandoned because it seemed impractical, they're all sitting across from you, waiting for an explanation you don't have. Think about it. The rest of the year you can stay in motion. You can optimize, distract, convince yourself that the emptiness is just temporary, that you're just between chapters, that things will click into place eventually. But December 25th doesn't negotiate, because this day comes with a script, a feeling you're supposed to access automatically, like breathing. And when you can't, when you sit down at that table and realize you're lip-syncing to a song everyone else seems to know by heart, that's when the weight becomes suffocating. Not because you're ungrateful, not because you don't want to feel it, but because you can't fake frequency. You can't manufacture belonging when the signal's distorted and everyone's pretending they can hear it clearly. What nobody admits, what nobody can admit without sounding like they've given up, is that symbolic days like this don't uplift the misaligned, they prosecute them. Christmas is an audit of the life you're living against the life you said you'd build. Between who you were told you'd become and who's actually staring back at you. So if today feels like judgment, you're not imagining it. You're just the only one honest enough to plead guilty. The comparison that destroys you isn't the one you make with strangers online. It's the one you make with yourself, not the person sitting next to you, not their family, their success, their perfectly wrapped life. You, the version you were supposed to become by now. The one you sketched out years ago when you still believed in timelines, when you thought life was a series of milestones, and if you just kept showing up, eventually you'd arrive at the person you promised yourself you'd be. Except you didn't. And now, Christmas shows up every year like an unannounced audit for a life you didn't realize was being graded. You sit at the table, same faces, same rituals, same songs, playing like a soundtrack to a movie you're no longer cast in. And something inside you starts whispering, I thought I'd have it together by now. I thought I'd feel more certain, more anchored, more finished. I thought I'd be someone who didn't have to rehearse joy before walking into a room. This isn't ingratitude. This isn't wanting more things or better circumstances. It's the suffocating realization that the life you're living has nothing to do with the life you were aiming for. And you can't identify the exact moment the gap opened up. Was it a decision you made? A risk you avoided? A part of yourself you buried because it seemed too reckless, too much, too uncertain? You don't know. And that unknowing is what makes today unbearable. Because you're not grieving what you lack. You're grieving who you've become without permission. The person sitting here performing warmth, pretending resonance, still exists. That's not who you thought you'd be. And no one warns you how isolating it is to become unrecognizable to your own expectations. Christmas doesn't ache because others have more. It aches because you've become less than you promised yourself, and you don't know how to get back. You can be in a room full of people and still feel like you're drowning in silence. Not because they're ignoring you, not because they don't care, but because no one's actually seeing you. You know what I mean? They're seeing the version of you they need you to be. The one who shows up on time, says the right things, laughs at the right moments, plays the part they've cast you in since childhood. But the person you actually are, the one sitting behind your eyes, carrying weight no one asks about, that person is invisible. And Christmas makes it worse because it's built on the fantasy of connection, of being known, of sitting across from people who are supposed to understand you without you having to explain, except they don't. They ask surface questions. They make surface observations. They hug you like muscle memory and move on to the next person before you've even finished answering. And you smile, you nod, you pretend that's enough, but it's not enough. Because what you're starving for isn't attention, it's not validation or praise or even love in the traditional sense. It's recognition, the bone-deep need to have someone look at you and say, without words, I see what you're carrying. I see who you've had to become to survive this year. I see the parts of you that are dying quietly while everyone celebrates. But no one does. Because they're all performing too, all pretending their own weight is manageable, all playing roles in a script no one admits is fiction. And that's the cruelty of it. You're surrounded by people, but emotionally, you're in solitary confinement. Because connection without depth isn't connection, it's choreography. And you've spent so long dancing to someone else's rhythm that you've forgotten what your own sounds like. So the emptiness you feel today isn't about being alone. It's about being unseen, while everyone swears they're looking right at you. And that kind of loneliness doesn't have a cure you can buy or a tradition you can perform. It just sits there, growing heavier while the carols play on. Your brain does something strange with Christmas. It doesn't file it under holiday or tradition. It files it under survival. Because at some primal level, Christmas isn't about presents or dinner or nostalgia. It's about answering a question your nervous system has been asking since you were a child. Do I still belong here? Not in this room, not at this table, in existence. In the ongoing story of people who matter, people who are remembered, people whose absence would actually leave a hole. And when your brain scans the room on December 25th, it's looking for evidence, proof that you're still woven into something larger than yourself, that your presence registers, that the narrative continues with you in it, not in spite of you. But what happens when that proof doesn't come? When the conversations flow around you, not through you? When the memories being shared are ones you're not part of? When the future plans being made don't automatically include your name? Your brain doesn't interpret that as coincidence. It interprets it as exile, And exile triggers something ancient, something that predates language, a grief that has no name because it's not about losing someone. It's about losing your place. You're still here, still breathing, still functional. But the thread that used to tie you to continuity, to family, to relevance, to mattering in a way that doesn't require you to constantly prove it, that thread has frayed, and you feel it most on days like today. Because Christmas is supposed to reaffirm that you belong to something enduring, that you're part of a lineage, a tradition, a story bigger than your individual life. But when the life you're living now doesn't connect to the life you thought you were building, when the person you've become doesn't fit the role you were cast in, you're not just sad. You're grieving a membership you didn't know you'd lost. And no one taught you how to mourn something that never had a funeral. And this is where it gets dangerous. Because most people who feel this weight on Christmas do something catastrophic without realizing it. They turn it inward. They look at everyone else seemingly floating through the day with ease, with warmth, with that automatic access to joy, and they conclude, the problem is me. I'm the defective one. Everyone else got the software update and I'm still running on something outdated, broken, incompatible. So they start performing harder, smiling wider, forcing gratitude like it's a muscle they can strengthen through repetition. They tell themselves, if I just try harder to feel it, maybe it'll become real. But it doesn't, because what they're experiencing isn't a personal failure. It's a signal, a warning light indicating that somewhere along the way, the life they're living stopped aligning with the person they're becoming, and no amount of forced positivity can bridge that gap. Think about it. You don't feel empty at Christmas because you're broken. You feel empty because you've outgrown a narrative that everyone around you is still subscribed to. The script says, show up, feel grateful, connect, belong. But your reality says, I don't recognize this life as mine anymore. And when those two things collide, expectation versus lived experience, the dissonance is unbearable. So you start believing the story everyone implies, but no one says out loud. If you can't feel the magic, you're the problem. If you can't access the warmth, you're defective. If Christmas feels hollow, it's because something inside you is broken. But what if that's not true? What if the hollowness isn't a flaw in your wiring? What if it's your system trying to tell you that you've been living in a frequency that no longer matches who you are? And the only way forward is to stop pretending it does. What if the weight you feel isn't something to fix? What if it's something to listen to? But underneath all of that, underneath the forced smiles and the hollow gratitude and the performance of normalcy, there's something else. Something you don't say out loud because it sounds too desperate, too pathetic, too much like admitting defeat. The fear that you're being left behind. Not in some abstract philosophical way, in a real, suffocating, irreversible way. You watch people around you building lives that look coherent, that look intentional, like they sat down with a blueprint and actually followed it, step by step, until everything clicked into place. And you're still trying to figure out which direction is forward. They're talking about mortgages, promotions, kids' schools, summer plans, and you're sitting there wondering if anyone would notice if you just stopped participating entirely. Not because you're suicidal, not because you've given up, but because you're exhausted from pretending you're on the same timeline as everyone else when you can barely remember what you're supposed to be racing toward. And Christmas amplifies that. Because while the world celebrates continuity, momentum, arrival, you're stuck in a permanent state of not yet stable, not yet certain, not yet the person who gets to relax into their life instead of white-knuckling through it. And the worst part? You start wondering if this is just who you are now, if maybe some people are meant to build and others are meant to watch, if maybe the life you imagined was never actually available to you, and everyone else knew it except you. So you sit at the table, you nod, you laugh when you're supposed to, but inside you're calculating how far behind you've fallen and whether the gap is still closable or if you've already missed the window, if the train left, the door closed, the invitation expired, And now you're just here, breathing, functional, present, but fundamentally, irreversibly out of sync with the life everyone promised was supposed to feel like home. So what do you do with that? What do you do when the weight is real, when the distance is undeniable, when you can't fake your way back into a feeling that abandoned you years ago? Most people will tell you to be grateful, to focus on what you have, to reframe your perspective, practice mindfulness, choose joy. And maybe that works for someone whose life just needs a tune-up. But when the dissonance runs this deep, when the gap between who you are and the life you're inhabiting feels unbridgeable, gratitude doesn't fix that. Positivity doesn't close that wound. What you need isn't a mindset shift, it's permission. Permission to stop pretending the script fits, permission to admit that the life you're living, no matter how objectively fine it looks, feels fundamentally wrong in a way you can't articulate without sounding ungrateful or broken. Permission to acknowledge that you don't need more holiday spirit or forced cheer, or another year of trying to convince yourself that eventually it'll click, because it won't. Not until you stop treating this ache like a problem to solve and start treating it like information to honor. The heaviness you feel isn't a malfunction. It's clarity trying to break through a lifetime of conditioning that taught you to ignore your own frequency in favor of everyone else's expectations. And the reason Christmas feels unbearable isn't because you're failing at joy. It's because you're finally too exhausted to keep lying to yourself about what resonates and what doesn't. So no, you don't need a better attitude. You don't need to try harder, be more present, appreciate more deeply. You need to stop forcing yourself to feel at home in a life that was never built for the person you're becoming. And that's not pessimism. That's the first honest thing you've allowed yourself to think in years. Because the ache isn't asking you to fix it. It's asking you to finally listen. And this is what separates you from most people walking through today. Not that you're sadder, not that you're more broken, but that you're awake in a way that's almost unbearable. Most people can feel the dissonance and bury it. They can sense the gap between who they are and the life they're performing. And they'll spend decades numbing it, explaining it away, medicating it with busyness or achievement or the next distraction. But you can't. Something in you won't let you look away anymore. You've reached the threshold where pretending costs more than confronting, where the energy it takes to fake resonance is finally, mercifully greater than the fear of admitting it's gone. And that's not weakness. That's the rarest form of courage most people will never access. Because it's easier to keep playing the part, easier to blame yourself for not feeling what you're supposed to feel, easier to believe that if you just optimize harder, meditate longer, reframe better, eventually the life you're living will start to feel like yours. But you know better now. You know that the weight you're carrying isn't a bug in your system. It's a signal that you've been ignoring your own frequency for so long that your entire existence has become an echo of someone else's expectations. And Christmas, brutal, unrelenting, suffocating Christmas, is just the day when the volume gets so loud you can't pretend you don't hear it anymore. So if today feels impossibly heavy, if the emptiness feels like it's swallowing you whole, if you're sitting in that room wondering how much longer you can keep showing up to a life that doesn't feel like it belongs to you, that's not you breaking. That's you waking up. And what happens next, what you do with that awareness, with that honesty, with that unbearable clarity, that's not something anyone can prescribe. But it starts with stopping the performance, stopping the apologies, stopping the desperate attempt to feel something you've been forcing for years. It starts with the brutal, liberating truth. You can't go back to sleep. So if today feels empty, maybe it's not asking you to find joy. Maybe it's asking you to find truth, not the kind that comes with answers or action steps or a roadmap forward. Just the raw, uncomfortable truth that the life you're living and the person you're becoming are no longer speaking the same language. And that's not something you fix by next Christmas. It's something you sit with, something you honor, something you stop apologizing for, because the world will keep telling you to be grateful, to look on the bright side, to choose happiness like it's a switch you haven't tried flipping yet. But you know better now. You know that the weight isn't the problem. Ignoring it is. So if you're here, if you made it through this video, if something in these words felt like someone finally said the thing you've been thinking in silence for years, leave a comment, even if it's just one word, even if it's just felt, because this space, Mindern, doesn't exist to give you answers all the time. It exists to hold the questions no one else will sit with and guide you to find out your own way, and you're not alone in carrying them.